I was embarrassed, chagrined, alarmed, humiliated at the length. Leo Tolstoy wrote War and Peace, had a snack, then took a nap, and all of that was completed before I finished my sermon 2 weeks ago. So I vow now to be very brief, mercifully brief, direct, to the point tonight. I want to, for a short time, with the disciples, marvel at Christ's ascension. Orson Scott Card may or may not be a name that you know, depending upon how often you lurk in sci-fi corners of pop culture. Orson Scott Card actually is a prolific and quite famous sci-fi author in the kingdom of nerdery. If you come and visit there with me, I will show you all around. I have read nothing of his, I don't believe. I went through a really intense sci-fi phase when I was 16, 17, 18, so it's possible that I encountered him and it didn't register and I moved on. My tastes run elsewhere. Isaac Asimov, primarily. Anyway, in 2013, his most famous novel, which is one of the best-selling sci-fi novels ever, Ender's Game, was made into a film. This was greatly anticipated by many, and it bombed. It bombed thoroughly. The film barely made any money at all. It made variety magazines and entertainment magazines top 10 worst films of the year. It bombed utterly. I never saw it, and so I can't say whether it was good or not, whether it was faithful to the spirit of the book. So much into Orson Scott Card's brief foray into filmmaking. Or was it? In 1988, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Orson Scott Card was the writer for a children's DVD called He is Risen by Nest Entertainment. If you haven't heard of that, it's because you're not Mormon. It depicted the events from Easter Day to the Ascension. Now, my children came upon this obscure and curious DVD in our local Chippewa Public Library 3 years ago and have since constantly checked and rechecked it out. It is a running joke, actually, with the librarian, like every time they trot it up to the desk. Orson Scott Card is a Mormon. In fact, like Steve Young, the famous Hall of Fame left-handed quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, a direct descendant of Brigham Young. Or was it Joseph Smith? I should have looked that up beforehand. I know that he's a bigwig. He's important in kind of the Mormon family. And say what you will about Mormons, and there are things that we as confessing Christians definitely would have to say about them. But nevertheless, this is curious. They have a fierce devotion to the King James Bible, or as the English call it, the authorized version. In fact, it is their only real permitted version. And so almost all the dialogue in this slightly hokey 1988 Easter cartoon that my children watched nonstop over the last 3 years is pulled straight from the King James Bible. Thank you, Mormons. One day as I was doing household chores, I heard a child's voice say, I'm not going to imitate my children, because that'll sound like I'm mocking them, but ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven. I was puzzled. This disembodied voice in the Queen's English. And I went in to an adjacent room to find Bryden playing with Legos and actually reciting this repeatedly, almost absent-mindedly. Perhaps almost like you'd see in a horror film as children recite things repeatedly as playing with dolls or blocks or whatever. Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus which is taken up from you into heaven shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven. Thank you, Orson Scott Card. You Mormon, you. And thank you, King James, for authorizing in 1611 that lovely translation that has aged so well. The walls of my house now resound continually with its sonorous tones, thanks to you too. Why stand ye gazing up into heaven? In order to keep this sermon short this evening, I will limit myself to 2 points. It seems like all reputable preachers use 3, but we'll stick with 2 tonight in our short meditation. First point, the Ascension as an ending. Second point, the Ascension as a beginning. 1, the Ascension as an ending. And this portion will actually be a highly personal reflection on the Ascension. This may resonate with you, or it may not, and you may find me strange and sentimental and triacly and odd. But bear with me and realize that there are others that feel this way. I bounced this off of others this week as I was preparing for this highly personal reflection. The Ascension has, for about 10 years, I would guess, and that's about the time that I've been a Christian as an adult. I grew up in the church, left the faith rather angrily and violently in my college age, and came to it as an adult. For about 10 years, the Ascension has had an odd effect on me. I'm slightly saddened by it. If I'm honest, I have to say that I feel a little abandoned. If I were to pick one word to name, abandoned. His work, this Savior of mine, his work is done. And now he's left. He's really gone. Of course, this is ridiculous on his face. Who am I? I was not with the disciples, with Jesus. Through thick and through thin, I did not see his glory face to face. There are surely benefits had I have been there, and obviously there are benefits to not having to endure what they endured. But it's ridiculous. I wasn't there, so what does this mean that I feel abandoned? But I've learned to treasure the annual rhythms of life as a Christian. I've come to deeply rely annually on walking with Christ, the path that he walked, this annual pilgrimage that we make as Christians from cradle to cross and beyond. This annual pilgrimage will create deep and reliable grooves in your life's road as we, as a church, as a family, find ourselves walking with Jesus through his life, specifically in our church calendar from December to May. We peer with silent awe and wonder into a manger and behold a baby, God himself, having taken on all that tender frailty of an infant. God becoming breakable, like your favorite ornament that your child trashes. God becoming breakable for us. We see a few snippets of childhood with Simeon. We look at this newborn child and behold the salvation of Israel. We watch his first miracle at a wedding feast, at the urging of his mother. Perhaps we might say at the nagging of his mother. And he with the mother, my time has not yet come, with the retort, the familiar family retort. Turn water into wine, a hint, a foreshadow of the lavish wedding feast he will someday throw for you, his bride. We continue to walk with him through his life, for he is our childhood pattern. Day by day, like us, he grew. He was little, weak, and helpless. Tears and smiles, like us, he knew. And he feeleth for our sadness, and he shareth in our gladness, as a Christmas carol says. We watch him give the blind sight, the deaf hearing, make the lame to run. And we watch him, as St. Luke says ominously, set his face to Jerusalem, knowing what he must do, the cup of wrath that he must drink to the dregs, as the psalmist says. We gaze upon his blessed death and passion. Or more accurately, he gazes at us. From the cross, it's from his head, his hands, his feet. Sorrow and love flow mingled down. And says to us, all for you. All of it for you. And in these last 7 weeks, we see him resurrected, appearing to his disciples, to comfort them, and to instruct them for what's to come. And now, we see him ascended, gone. In short, we've walked through his entire life story, and I have done that for the last 10 years. We've reached the end. His story is your story. His life is your life. His hope, his story is your hope, your comfort, your everything. He, this man, this God-man who loves us perfectly. In fact, this is only the perfect love you will ever receive this side of the grave. My Savior's love to me, love to the loveless shown, that they might lovely be. Oh, who am I that for my sake my Lord should take frail flesh and die? And when you walk with someone year after year, someone who loves you, knows you perfectly, that someone becomes a friend, a best friend. It's a hokey phrase, a best friend. It's become even worse by the stupid acronym BFF. Best friends are treasures. And as Christians, we have someone we call our best friend. I'll quote the same hymn that I just quoted. I don't mean to get into the weeds academically. A introverted Anglican priest in the 17th century, Samuel Crossman. He actually knew George Herbert, if you like English poetry. He wrote a song. My song is Love Unknown. I already read a verse. I'm reading a book right now, 1,000 pages, titled Christianity, the First 3,000 Years, which is pretentious and also hopeful. And anyway, the book opens with a couple of stanzas from this poem, meditating on the fact that Christianity is basically a personality cult. This man we fall in love with and gaze upon day after day and walk with. Anyhow, my Savior's love to me, I read that already, next verse. No story so divine. Never was love, dear King. Never was grief like thine. This is my friend, in whose sweet phrase I all my days could gladly spend. And so I feel it's natural, upon beholding the Ascension, to feel like your best friend has left. I hope maybe that makes sense to you now, kind of walking through this way with me. This is my friend, in whose sweet praise I all my days could gladly spend. And I hope you feel that way too, that this is your friend, in whose days you could gladly spend eternity. It feels like an ending. It just does. I have to be honest. It feels like an ending to me. The Ascension can feel like an ending. But, ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? The angel's words, or rather the men in white, as St. Luke records, their words always felt like a bit of a rebuke to me. Like, what am I doing staring up into heaven? It was common in World War I and in World War II, before Skype and FaceTime and other ways of contacting people, for parents, wives, girlfriends, families in general to treasure photographs of the men who were off serving in the military. You didn't know when, or even if, he was coming back. But you could gaze at the photo. In fact, when no one was looking, and you've probably read about this in books or seen this in movies, you could even caress the photo, trace the familiar lines in the forehead or the face or the crow's feet around the eyes. You You could even kiss the photograph. And there was comfort and consolation in that, ridiculous as you might feel if suddenly you're aware that your younger brother is in the corner snickering at you. But would you kiss the photograph if the man himself, the soldier, was standing in the room? It would suddenly become obvious to you that the photograph was a pale imitation, that it was a two-dimensional replica, just a shadow of the real man. As we read today of the disciples gazing into heaven, in a way we're kissing a photograph. Our yearly walk with him, following our friend, our dear friend, through his life story. It isn't the actual rich, fulfilled friendship. That is coming, and he has promised that. And we can trust his promise in that. That is what we look forward to. But he has to ascend for us to be able to achieve that. He has to. He has to go and be seated at the right hand of his Father. If we are actually to be united with him, face to face. Fanny Crosby was a 19th century poet and hymn writer, and if you grew up in certain denominations like me in the Methodist Church, you sang a lot of her hymns. Some of them can be really good, some of them can be kind of Victorian, sappy, whatever. But she was blind. And when she would be asked about her blindness, she would say, "Oh, no. This is a blessing. Do you realize the first thing I will see is my Savior's face?" Our dear friend's face. He has to be ascended for us to be reunited. That part has to happen. Point 2, the ascension as a beginning. As a beginning. It's clearer in Luke's account of the ascension at the end of his gospel than it is in his account in Acts. But his disciples are excited by the ascension. Okay, I just mangled that. Let me explain. Luke wrote 2 accounts of the ascension. One of them is at the end of his gospel account, and the other is at the beginning of his account of the Acts of the Apostles, which we just heard tonight, read by Galbraith the Younger. Good work. In the account that we didn't hear, the end of his gospel, we actually get a sense of they're excited. In the last 2 verses of St. Luke's gospel, read like this. Okay, he ascends. "And they worship him, and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and were continually in the temple blessing God." With great joy. Now, my Kirk Haberman slightly dubious translation of "with great joy" is this. That was awesome. Did you see that? Like he went up into a cloud. This was like the Old Testament. They were probably looking at each other, and they probably thought of 2 great clouds. There are a handful of times when clouds appear in the Old Testament. The 2 great clouds, of course, the pillar of cloud that leads the Israelites by day, saves them from Egypt, leads them away from Pharaoh's army, ultimately across the Red Sea, and then ultimately into the Promised Land. A sign of the Lord's presence, a sign of his promise, a sign of him leading on ahead. The second time, a sign of the Lord's presence, is when Solomon prays the prayer. We read this in Chronicles. When the temple is completed, and suddenly this great cloud and fire and thunder descends upon the temple and fills the temple. And it's clearly an awesome, in the old-fashioned King James sense of the word awesome, an awesome sign of the Lord's presence. And so Peter, James, John, the disciples, knowing their Old Testament, probably were like, "Man, that was like what Solomon did. That was awesome. Like he went into the cloud." And we're told at the end of Luke that they go back to the temple and worship. And they continue to do that until Pentecost. We'll see that next week. That was awesome. Did you see that? Peter, James, and John had already beheld his glory at the transfiguration. And that obviously so transfixed Peter that Peter refers to it in several of his sermons in Acts. When he has a chance, when he has 5 minutes to tell people about Jesus, he always brings up the transfiguration. I'm guessing that probably there for the first time they dimly perceived that this man, this rabbi, this Jewish sage, was also the Lord of all creation. When for a moment the mask slips and they see that this is God. His face is glowing on the mountain. Now the Ascension seals it. The slaughtered lamb, or rather the good shepherd who for the sheep was slaughtered. The slaughtered lamb is crowned Lord of all, King of kings, and Lord of lords. As we'll confess in a moment in the Apostles' Creed, he sits now at the right hand of the Father. And what is a right hand for doing? Unless you're left-handed like me, but we'll go with the old-fashioned sense. What is a right hand for? A right hand is for doing things. It's for ruling. And don't forget, this risen, ascended, glorified Lord of all creation is still a man. He has brought our human nature, your human nature, and raised it up as at God's right hand. Man, with God, is on the throne. Oh, Jesus, in your ascension, we by faith behold our own. We heard Andrew DeFusco last week as he preached. He joked that all preachers basically have one sermon. They just move the parts around, but they basically say the same thing. I think I'm beginning to understand what he meant. And I'm finding that I'm compelled to preach over and over the incarnation, the mystery of God made man. This incarnation, that God became like us and took on our flesh, is finally completed in the Ascension. Our fallen human nature is restored. A human body is at the right hand of God the Father. That is a great mystery that it's difficult to understand. I don't know if you have a part of you that's kind of into the latest wave of science fascination. There's Andrew deGrasse Tyson. It's a very pretentious 3-part name. Recently had his series Cosmos that came out. There have been other series that have marveled at how the universe is, how it was created. It's difficult for us to reconcile with what we know about the universe, that there is somewhere, in some pocket, the ascended, glorified Lord Jesus Christ, ruling on a throne, crowned with the crown above all crowns. But there he is, sitting at the right hand of God. His story is our story, and his throne will be our throne. In John chapter 14, which Sean read today, in the passage just before where he read, he tells his disciples, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I not have told you?" It's a goofy thing to say. "I go to prepare a place for you." Jesus promised explicitly how and where he would be present. He told his disciples that he will be present even upon ascending in the proclamation of the word, in the breaking of the bread, the cup, his name etched on your forehead, in his